The autumn wind swept through Bramble Creek like a whispered curse, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and the sharper bite of approaching winter. Eliza Morgan stood at the kitchen window of the Creekside Inn, her flour-dusted hands paused mid-need as she watched the townspeople gather in the square. She knew what they were saying. She always knew. "Poor fat Eliza," they would murmur behind gloved hands, making up stories about a husband in the mountains, as if any man would claim her. At 28, Eliza had long since grown accustomed to the weight of their judgment, though it never grew lighter. Her body, generous and soft where frontier life demanded lean hardness, had marked her as different from her earliest days. The other girls had married at 16, 17, their slim waists cinched tight in borrowed wedding dresses. Eliza had remained at the inn, her worth measured in biscuits baked and stews stirred, never in the currency of desirability. The inn belonged to Marcus Hendricks, a man whose smile never reached his eyes and whose ledgers never quite balanced in favor of those who owed him. Eliza had worked for him since her parents died of cholera 7 years prior, their small homestead absorbed into Hendricks's growing collection of properties. She worked for room and board, Hendricks reminded her often, and wasn't she grateful for his Christian charity? "Eliza," Hendricks's voice cut through her thoughts like a cleaver through bone. "The miller wants his supper ready within the hour. Don't burn it like you did last week's roast." Silas Miller. The name alone made Eliza's stomach clench. He owned the only mill for 50 miles, and with it, he owned the livelihoods of every farmer in 3 counties. At 58, he'd buried 2 wives already, the second having died under circumstances the town doctor wouldn't discuss in polite company. Now his pale eyes followed Eliza whenever he visited the inn, lingering on her curves with an appetite that had nothing to do with food. It had been 3 months since Eliza's desperate lie had taken root. Miller had cornered her in the storage room, his whiskey-soured breath hot against her ear as he'd run his fingers along her arm. "A woman your age, your size, you should be grateful for any offer. Hendricks tells me you owe him considerable debt. I could settle it, make you respectable." The words had tumbled out before Eliza could stop them, born of pure panic and a half-remembered dream. "I'm already spoken for. My fiancé is a mountain man. He'll be back for me." Miller had stepped back, surprise flickering across his weathered face. "A mountain man? What's his name?" "Cole," she'd said, the name surfacing from a memory 4 years old, a bearded stranger who'd stumbled into the inn one November night, burning with fever and half dead from exposure. She'd nursed him for 3 days while he'd thrashed and muttered in delirium. When he'd woken, lucid at last, he'd looked at her with eyes the color of storm clouds and said, "You saved my life, miss." He'd stayed another week, helping with repairs and splitting wood, his massive frame making short work of tasks that took Eliza twice as long. He'd eaten her cooking with genuine appreciation, never once making jokes about her size or commenting on how much she served herself. On the day he'd left, he'd pressed a skinning knife into her hands, its handle carved with her name and a simple message. "Eliza, thank you for saving me from the fever." "I'll remember this kindness," he'd said, and then he'd ridden north into the mountains, and Eliza had watched until he disappeared into the pine forests that crowned the peaks. She'd never expected to see him again. The mountains took as many men as they made. But in that storage room with Miller's hands on her, the memory of Cole had seemed like salvation. So she'd lied. At first, Hendricks had seemed to accept it. Miller had withdrawn his immediate interest, though his eyes still tracked her movements. For a few blessed weeks, Eliza had been left alone, her fictional fiancé a shield against unwanted advances. Then the questions had started. "When's this mountain man coming back?" asked Sarah Pritchard, the banker's wife, her tone honeyed with false concern. "What's his last name?" demanded Deputy Clark, suspicious of any stranger who might claim a local woman. "Why hasn't he sent word?" wondered Father Benedict, the priest whose sermons on honesty felt increasingly pointed. Eliza had answered as best she could, weaving elaborations onto her initial lie like patches on worn fabric. Cole was trapping in the high country. Mail was unreliable. He'd be back before winter. Each addition felt like another shovel of dirt on her eventual grave. The town's amusement had curdled into cruelty by midsummer. Children sang rhymes about the mountain man who didn't exist. Women whispered that Eliza had grown so desperate for marriage that she'd invented a fiancé rather than face her spinsterhood with dignity. Men laughed openly, placing bets on how long she'd maintain the charade. Hendricks had finally delivered his ultimatum 2 weeks ago, in front of a dining room full of patrons. The Harvest Festival is October 15th. If your mountain man hasn't appeared by then to claim you proper, you'll marry Silas Miller. He's agreed to clear your parents' debt and pay your wages owed. It's more than generous for a woman in your position. The dining room had erupted in approving murmurs. Miller had smiled, showing yellowed teeth. Father Benedict had nodded solemnly, as if Hendricks had just proposed an act of charity rather than selling Eliza like livestock. She'd felt the trap snap shut around her. Now, with October 15th only 3 days away, Eliza moved through her duties in a fog of dread. She made her pies and roasted her chickens and scrubbed her pots, all while the knife Cole had given her rested in her apron pocket, her only proof that he'd existed at all, though even that was beginning to feel like something she might have imagined. The morning of October 15th dawned cold and clear, the kind of crystalline autumn day that made the mountains stand out sharp against the sky. Eliza dressed in her only good dress, a blue calico that she'd let out twice over the years, and pinned up her brown hair with hands that trembled despite her best efforts to steady them. She'd spent the previous night sleepless, staring at the ceiling of her tiny room and turning over possibilities. She could run, but to where? She had no money, no skills beyond cooking, and winter was coming. She could refuse. But Hendricks had made it clear that refusal meant being turned out with nothing, her parents' debt unpaid and her reputation destroyed beyond even its current ruins. She could pray for a miracle, but God had never seemed particularly interested in Eliza Morgan's problems before. The Harvest Festival transformed the town square into something almost beautiful. Bunting hung between buildings, and tables groaned under the weight of contributed dishes. Children ran between the adults, their laughter bright in the cool air. The church stood at the square's far end, its white steeple pointing toward a heaven that felt very far away. Eliza walked to the square alone. The other women from the inn, the serving girls who were younger and prettier, and who giggled about Beau, had left earlier, whispering to each other and falling silent when Eliza approached. She didn't need to hear their words to know their content. When she arrived, the crowd parted around her like water around a stone. She felt their stares, heard the barely suppressed snickers. Someone had hung a crudely drawn sign on the church door. Wedding today, the bridegroom might be imaginary. Heat flooded Eliza's face, but she kept her chin up and her eyes forward. She'd spent too long bowing under their mockery. If this was to be her last day of freedom, she'd face it standing straight. Hendricks materialized at her elbow, his grip on her arm just shy of painful. "Time to put this foolishness to rest, Eliza. Miller's waiting inside. Father Benedict's ready to perform the ceremony." "The festival doesn't start for another hour," Eliza said, her voice steadier than she felt. "You said he had until the festival." "I said until today. Today's here. Where's your mountain man?" Hendricks made a show of looking around, cupping his hand to his ear. "Don't hear any horses. Don't see any buckskin-clad heroes riding in. Seems to me you've got a choice. Walk into that church with dignity or be dragged in. Either way, you're marrying Miller and clearing your debt." Around them, the crowd had grown quiet, everyone watching the confrontation with the avid interest of spectators at a hanging. Eliza saw pity on some faces, satisfaction on others, and cold calculation on most. This was entertainment, she realized. Her humiliation was their festival amusement. Silas Miller emerged from the church, dressed in a black suit that might have been handsome on a different man. On him, it looked like a shroud. He smiled at Eliza, and she saw triumph in his watery eyes. "Miss Morgan," he said, his voice carrying across the square. "I'm a patient man, but my patience has limits. Your little fantasy has run its course. Time to face reality." "His name is Cole," Eliza said, surprised by the strength in her own voice. "And he's real." Miller laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "Then where is he?" Eliza's hand found the knife in her pocket, her fingers tracing the carved letters of her name. "I don't know," she admitted, and the honesty of it felt like defeat. But he was real. He is real. "A rusty knife with a name on it proves nothing," said Deputy Clark, who'd examined the blade weeks ago when questions about Cole's identity had reached official ears. Could have carved that yourself, or bought it from a peddler. Any trapper might have stayed at the inn over the years. Doesn't mean you're engaged to him. She's a liar, someone called from the crowd. My Susie said Eliza probably read about mountain men in some dime novel and made the whole thing up. The crowd murmured agreement. Eliza felt tears burning behind her eyes but refused to let them fall. She wouldn't give them that satisfaction. Father Benedict appeared in the church doorway, his vestments bright white against the weathered wood. I think we've waited long enough. Miss Morgan, Mr. Miller has shown considerable patience and generosity. It's time to accept God's plan for you. God's plan. As if God planned for women to be sold to brutes to settle debts they'd never agreed to shoulder. Hendricks tugged on Eliza's arm, pulling her toward the church steps. She resisted, her heels digging into the dirt, but he was stronger and she was alone. The crowd pressed in behind them, eager to witness the spectacle. Please, Eliza whispered, though she didn't know who she was begging. Hendricks, Miller, God, or the ghost of a mountain man who'd probably forgotten her years ago. Please. Enough dramatics, Miller growled, reaching for her other arm. You're mine now, woman. Better get used to it. His fingers closed around her wrist, squeezing hard enough to bruise. Eliza gasped at the pain, and something inside her cracked. She wasn't going to walk into that church. She wasn't going to marry this man. She would run, consequences be damned, and if she died in the wilderness, at least she'd die free. She opened her mouth to scream her refusal, and the thunder of hoofbeats drowned out her voice. The crowd turned as one, faces swiveling toward the sound. From the north road, where the mountains rose like giants against the sky, a rider appeared. At first he was just a silhouette, man and horse moving as one unit, but as he drew closer, details emerged. A massive bay stallion, its coat dark with sweat. A rider dressed in buckskin and fur, a rifle slung across his back. Dark hair hanging past his shoulders, a beard covering the lower half of his face, and across one cheek, a jagged scar that caught the morning light. The rider didn't slow as he entered the square. The crowd scattered, men grabbing children and women pressing back against buildings. The horse's hooves struck sparks from the stones as the rider guided it straight toward the church steps where Eliza stood frozen, Hendricks's hand still on her arm and Miller's grip still tight on her wrist. The rider pulled his horse up short, the animal rearing slightly before settling. Then he dismounted in one fluid motion, landing with barely a sound despite his size. And he was huge, Eliza saw now, easily 6.5 feet tall with shoulders that seemed to stretch the seams of his buckskin shirt. He looked at Eliza and she saw his eyes, storm gray, just as she remembered them, and her heart, which had been hammering with fear, stumbled into a different rhythm entirely. Cole, she breathed. He heard her, despite the murmurs of the crowd and the stamping of his horse. His bearded face split into a smile that transformed him from terrifying to merely formidable. Eliza, he said, and his voice was deeper than she remembered, roughened by years of shouting across canyons and calling to pack animals. Sorry I'm late. Hendricks had released Eliza's arm when the horse had charged up, but Miller still gripped her wrist. Cole's eyes dropped to where the mill owner held her, and something dangerous flickered across his expression. Let her go, Cole said quietly. Miller's face had gone pale, but he held his ground. This woman owes debts. I'm settling them by making her my wife. This is a legal matter, not your concern. Cole took a single step forward. Despite Miller's bluster, the older man flinched. I'll explain this once, Cole said, his voice carrying across the square in the sudden silence. 4 years ago, I stumbled into the Creekside Inn half dead from fever. This woman, Eliza Morgan, nursed me for 3 days, fed me, changed my blankets when I sweat through them, sat with me when I was out of my head and talking to ghosts. She saved my life when she could have just let me die in a corner and saved herself the trouble. He reached into his shirt and pulled out a knife, twin to the one in Eliza's pocket, she realized, with his name carved on the handle. When I left, I gave her my word that I'd remember her kindness. I told her I'd come back when I could offer her something better than a sick man's gratitude. Cole's gaze swept the crowd, and Eliza saw people she'd known her whole life shrink under his scrutiny. I spent 3 years trapping and hunting, paying off my own debts and setting aside enough to build a proper homestead. I built a cabin big enough for a family. I cleared land and laid in supplies, and made a place worth offering to a good woman. He turned back to Miller, and his voice dropped to something that was almost a growl. I was planning to come down this spring, proper-like, with a ring and words fit for courting. But 2 weeks ago, a trapper named Red Jack stopped by my place. He'd been through Bramble Creek. He told me about a woman at the inn who'd claimed to be engaged to a mountain man named Cole, and how the whole town was laughing at her for making it up. Told me she was being forced to marry some mill owner to clear debts. Miller's grip on Eliza's wrist had loosened. Cole reached out and carefully, almost gently, removed the older man's hand entirely. So I rode for 2 weeks straight, Cole continued, changing horses at every trading post and settlement, to get here before anyone could force Eliza into something she didn't want. Because when I gave her that knife with her name on it, I was making a promise, and I don't break my promises. He finally looked back at Eliza, and she saw uncertainty in his eyes for the first time, as if he'd just realized that he'd ridden for 2 weeks and burst into a town square making claims on a woman who might not want him. I should have asked first, he said, quieter now, meant just for her. Should have written or sent word somehow. But I'm asking now, Eliza Morgan, will you marry me? I can't offer you much beyond a cabin in the mountains and a life that's harder than what you're used to. But I can offer you respect and honesty and a home where nobody will mock you or hurt you or treat you like property. The square was so quiet that Eliza could hear the wind rustling through the bunting overhead. Every eye was on her, waiting for her answer. She thought about the past 4 years, the mockery, the loneliness, the weight of being unwanted. She thought about Miller's cruel hands and Hendrix's calculating eyes and all the small cruelties the town had inflicted on her, death by 1,000 cuts of dismissal and disdain. And she thought about a fever-bright stranger who'd thanked her for simple kindness, who'd helped her with chores without being asked, who'd looked at her like she was a person rather than a problem. Yes, she said, and her voice rang clear across the square. Yes, I'll marry you. Cole's smile could have lit the whole town. He looked up at Father Benedict, who was still standing in the church doorway, looking utterly bewildered. Father, Cole said, his voice taking on an edge of challenge, you're ready to perform a wedding today. How about you marry us instead? Father Benedict looked like a man who'd just watched his carefully ordered universe tilt sideways. This is highly irregular. There are procedures, waiting periods. You were ready to marry her off 5 minutes ago without any of those procedures, Cole pointed out, his tone pleasant but his eyes hard. Seems to me the only thing that's changed is the groom. Hendrix had found his voice. Now see here, this man's a stranger. He could be anyone. We don't even know his full name or... Cole Barrett, Cole said, originally from Missouri, moved west in '85 after my parents died. I've trapped and hunted from the Bitterroots to the Cascades. I've traded at Fort Benton and Fort Hall. I've got no warrants, no debts, and no wives living or dead. I can provide references from a dozen trading posts and settlements if you need them, but that'll take time we don't have. He fixed Hendrix with a stare that made the innkeeper take a step back. And seeing as how you were ready to marry off a woman in your employ without her real consent to settle a debt she didn't owe, I don't think you've got much moral ground to stand on when it comes to questioning my character. A ripple went through the crowd, uncomfortable shuffling, people avoiding each other's eyes. Because Cole was right, and they all knew it. What had almost happened here wasn't marriage. It was a transaction in human flesh, dressed up in religious language and social propriety. Deputy Clark stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun belt in a gesture that was probably meant to be authoritative, but just looked nervous. Mr. Barrett, I'm going to need to verify your story. We can't just... You can verify it after the wedding, Cole interrupted. Or are you telling me that a woman needs a man's permission to choose her own husband? Because that's not how the law works, last I checked. Eliza's of age and of sound mind. If she wants to marry me, that's her choice. He looked back at Eliza, and something softened in his expression. Unless you want to wait, we can do this proper if you'd rather. I just figured, given the circumstances... Eliza understood what he wasn't saying. If they waited, Hendrix and Miller would have time to create obstacles, to raise objections, to find ways to prevent the marriage or force her hand another way. The frontier had laws, but enforcement was spotty at best, and men like Miller had ways of getting what they wanted. I don't want to wait, she said firmly. Then, because she needed to be honest with this man who'd ridden for 2 weeks to keep a promise he'd made to her years ago, she added, "But I need you to understand. I told people about you because I was desperate. I used your name as a shield. That wasn't fair to you, and I'm sorry." Cole's expression went soft in a way that made him look younger, less weathered. "Eliza, you saved my life. If my name could protect you even a little bit, then I'm glad you used it. I just wish I'd known sooner that you needed protecting." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and took her hand. His palm was calloused and warm, his fingers careful despite their obvious strength. "I meant what I said back then. I remember kindness, and I don't forget the people who show it to me." Eliza felt tears finally spill over, but these weren't tears of fear or humiliation. These were something else entirely. Relief, maybe, or hope, or just the release of 4 years of holding everything too tight inside. Father Benedict cleared his throat. "I suppose, under the circumstances, if Miss Morgan is willing—" "I am," Eliza said quickly, before anyone could raise new objections. "I want to marry Cole." Miller made a sound like a kettle boiling over. "This is absurd. Hendricks, you can't allow this. She owes you." "I'll settle her debts," Cole said calmly. He pulled a leather pouch from his belt and tossed it to Hendricks. It landed with a heavy clink of coins. "That's $200 in gold and silver, more than enough to cover whatever she supposedly owes you, plus her wages for the work she's done." Hendricks opened the pouch, and Eliza saw his eyes widen. It was more money than most people in Bramble Creek saw in a year. As for you," Cole said, turning to Miller, "I understand you've got a claim on some debt related to her parents' homestead?" Miller's jaw worked silently for a moment before he managed, 50 acres that should have been mine when they died. Good land, right by the creek." "How much?" $300, Miller said quickly, seeing an opportunity. "Plus interest over 7 years. 300's fair," Cole cut him off. He produced another pouch, heavier than the first. "Here, that clears any claim you got. The land goes back to Eliza, legal and proper." He looked around the square, meeting eyes that quickly glanced away. "Anyone else got a claim on my future wife? Speak now, because once we're married, any debts of hers become mine, and I pay my debts in full. But I also collect on debts owed to me, and I've got a long memory." The crowd was silent. Eliza realized she was shaking, not from fear now, but from the sheer unreality of the moment. This man, this near stranger, had just paid off her debts and reclaimed her parents' land in the space of minutes, had done what she'd been unable to do in 7 years of backbreaking work. "Why?" she whispered, too quiet for anyone but Cole to hear. He squeezed her hand gently. "Because you showed me kindness when you didn't have to. Because you're being treated unjustly, and I've got the means to fix it. And because—" He hesitated, then continued. "Because when I was delirious with fever, you sat beside me and sang. Do you remember?" Eliza did remember. She'd sung old hymns and folk songs, anything to fill the silence and maybe anchor him to the living world when he'd seemed about to slip away into death. "I heard you," Cole said. "Even through the fever, I heard your voice, and it was the kindest sound I'd ever heard. I told myself that if I lived, I'd find a way to deserve that kindness. This is me trying." "Yeah." Father Benedict's voice broke the moment. "If we're going to do this, we should do it now before I change my mind about the propriety of it all." Cole looked at Eliza, a question in his eyes. She nodded. They climbed the church steps together, hand in hand. Behind them, the crowd followed, not out of joy or celebration, Eliza thought, but out of morbid fascination and the inability to look away from the spectacle. The ceremony was brief. Father Benedict stumbled through the words, clearly still rattled by the morning's events. Cole's responses were clear and steady. When it came Eliza's turn to speak her vows, she looked up at this mountain of a man who'd appeared like an answer to prayers she hadn't quite dared to speak. "I do," she said, and meant it with an intensity that surprised her. They had no rings. Instead, Cole took the knife from Eliza's pocket, the one he'd given her years ago, and placed it back in her hands. "You kept this," he said softly. "It was all I had of you," she admitted. "The proof that you were real." He smiled, then produced his own matching knife. "And I kept this, with your name on it, kept it to remind me that there was kindness in the world, and that I owed a debt to the woman who'd shown it to me. Father Benedict pronounced them married with the air of a man who couldn't quite believe what he'd just done. Cole bent down. He had to bend quite far, Eliza realized, given their height difference, and kissed her. It was chaste and brief, appropriate for a church ceremony, but Eliza felt it down to her toes nonetheless. When they turned to face the crowd, she expected jeers or protests. Instead, she saw confusion, embarrassment, and on a few faces, what might have been shame. Because the town had shown its true nature this morning, had revealed itself as a place willing to sell a woman to settle debts, and now they all had to live with that knowledge. Cole led Eliza back down the steps toward his horse. The crowd parted for them, silent now. As they passed Hendricks, the innkeeper said weakly, "Her things are still in her room." "Keep them," Cole said without stopping, "or give them to someone who needs them. We've got everything we need." He helped Eliza onto the horse. She was heavier than the slim frontier women who rode with practiced ease, and she felt self-conscious about it. But Cole lifted her as if she weighed nothing and settled her in the saddle with gentle efficiency. Then he swung up behind her, one arm coming around her waist to hold her steady. "Ready?" he asked, his breath warm against her ear. Eliza looked back at the town square, at the people who'd mocked her, at the inn where she'd worked herself to exhaustion, at the church where she'd almost been forced into a nightmare marriage. Then she looked ahead, toward the mountains rising in the distance, mysterious and vast and free. "Yes," she said. "I'm ready. E." Cole spurred the horse forward, and they rode out of Bramble Creek as the sun climbed higher in the autumn sky. Behind them, the harvest festival would continue, but Eliza Morgan, now Eliza Barrett, would not be there to see it. She was going home, to a place she'd never been, with a man she barely knew, and she'd never felt more certain of anything in her life. The ride north took 3 days. Cole set a pace that was steady but not punishing, and they stopped frequently at settlements and trading posts where he was clearly known and respected. At each stop, he introduced Eliza as his wife with a pride that made her chest tight, and he spent his coin freely on supplies for their journey: warm blankets, dried provisions, and at one trading post, a beautiful wool coat in deep green that he insisted on buying for her. "Winter comes hard in the mountains," he explained as he helped her into it. "You'll need proper clothing." "Me." They talked as they rode, Cole's deep voice rumbling through his chest where Eliza leaned back against him. He told her about his life in the high country, the rhythms of trapping season, the brutal beauty of winter, the summer migrations of elk and deer. He spoke of his cabin, built over 3 summers of hard labor, and the valley where it stood. "It's not much compared to a town," he admitted. "Nearest neighbor is a day's ride. But there's good water, good hunting, and room to grow. I'm planning to put in crops next spring, maybe get some livestock eventually. Build it into a real homestead." Eliza found herself sharing things she'd never told anyone, about her parents, about the years at the inn, about the small humiliations that had accumulated like snow until she'd been buried under their weight. Cole listened without interrupting, his arm around her waist tightening slightly when her voice shook over the harder parts. "They shouldn't have treated you that way," he said finally, quietly. "No one should be made to feel less than human." "I'm fat," Eliza said bluntly, because the word had been used against her so often that she'd learned to say it first, to strip it of its power. "In a place where food is scarce and survival means being lean, I'm wrong somehow. An offense against frontier practicality." Cole was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "In the mountains, you need weight going into winter. Fat keeps you alive when game is scarce and the cold bites deep. The wolves and bears that survive are the ones that put on weight in the fall. Lean animals die when the snow comes." He paused, then continued, "But even if that wasn't true, even if there was no practical reason, you're a human being, Eliza. Your worth isn't determined by your size or shape. It's determined by your character, your actions, your heart. And from what I've seen, your heart is bigger than that whole damn town." Eliza felt tears threaten again and blinked them back. "You barely know me. I know you saved my life when you didn't have to. I know you sang to a dying stranger. I know you kept a promise, my knife, for 4 years. I know you stood up to a town full of people who were tearing you down. That's enough for me to know your character." On the third day, they climbed into the real mountains. The pines grew thick here, and the air thinned and chilled. Cole's horse picked its way along trails that Eliza couldn't always see, but the animal seemed to know where it was going. Finally, as the sun was setting and painting the peaks orange and gold, they crested a ridge, and Eliza saw the valley. It was beautiful in a way that made her throat tight. A stream ran through its center, feeding into a small lake that reflected the sky like polished silver. Meadows, brown now with autumn but clearly lush in summer, spread out from the water. And there, at the edge of the tree line, stood a cabin. It wasn't grand, but it was solid. Built of whole logs with a stone chimney and real glass windows that must have cost a fortune to transport this far from civilization. A barn stood beside it, smaller than the cabin but well built, and Eliza could see neat stacks of firewood under a covered shelter. "That's home," Cole said, and she heard both pride and nervousness in his voice. "I know it's not much." "It's perfect," Eliza interrupted, because it was. Not perfect in the sense of being fancy or comfortable by town standards, but perfect because it was honest. A place built by hard work for a specific purpose, every log and nail placed with intention. Cole guided the horse down into the valley as dusk settled over the mountains. By the time they reached the cabin, stars were emerging overhead, more stars than Eliza had ever seen in her life, unobscured by town lights or chimney smoke. He helped her down from the horse, then stood there looking at her in the fading light. "I should tell you," he said, "the cabin's only got one room, one bed. I built it for myself, not for... I wasn't expecting... What I'm trying to say is, I can sleep in the barn tonight, until you're comfortable. We're married legally, but that doesn't mean..." "Cole," Eliza said gently, cutting off his awkward stumbling, "I understand what you're offering, and I appreciate it. But you've been honorable and kind and patient, and I'm not going to make you sleep in your own barn." She took a breath, steadying herself. "I won't pretend I'm not nervous. I barely know you, and this is all happening so fast. But I chose this. I chose you. And I want to try to make this marriage real, not just a legal arrangement." Cole's face softened in the starlight. "We'll take it slow," he promised. "We've got time to learn each other. No rush." He opened the cabin door and lit a lantern, and warm light spilled out into the darkness. Eliza stepped inside and looked around her new home. The single room was larger than she'd expected, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and a bed built into the opposite corner. A table and chairs stood near the fireplace, along with a rocking chair that looked hand-carved. Shelves lined the walls, holding supplies and tools organized with careful precision. The floor was wood planks, swept clean, and there were actual curtains on the windows, rough fabric, but curtains nonetheless. "You made this," Eliza said wonderingly. "All of this." "Took 3 years," Cole admitted. "Probably would have been faster if I'd hired help, but I wanted to do it myself. Wanted to know every inch of it was solid." Eliza walked to the shelves, running her fingers along the wood. There were books there, not many, but more than she'd expected. A Bible, a few volumes of poetry, a practical guide to animal husbandry. And there, on one shelf at eye level, was a space that looked like it had been deliberately left empty. "I was saving that space for things you might want to put there," Cole said from behind her. "Figured you'd have belongings, keepsakes. Then I got to the town and realized you were leaving with nothing but the dress on your back and my old knife." "I have everything I need," Eliza said, and was surprised to find she meant it. The first weeks in the mountain valley passed in a blur of activity and adjustment. Cole had been right about winter coming hard. Snow arrived in early November and didn't let up until late March. But the cabin proved solid, the supplies abundant, and Eliza discovered that she had a talent for mountain living that surprised them both. She'd spent years cooking for crowds at the inn, managing complex meals with limited resources. Here, she adapted those skills to wilderness conditions, making the most of Cole's hunting and their stored provisions. She learned to smoke meat and tan hides, to render fat and preserve vegetables in ways that would keep them edible through the long frozen months. Cole proved to be the man she'd glimpsed during his fever-ridden stay at the inn. Quiet but thoughtful, strong but gentle, and possessed of a dry humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh. He treated her with a respect she'd never experienced before, asking her opinion on decisions and listening when she spoke. The physical side of their marriage developed slowly, as Cole had promised. The cabin's single room and bed meant they shared space from the first night, but Cole never pushed or demanded. Instead, they learned each other gradually, the comfort of sleeping side by side, the casual touches that grew more frequent and less tentative, the growing warmth that built between them like the fire in the hearth. It was Eliza who made the first real move, 3 weeks into their marriage. Cole had been teaching her to shoot, standing behind her to help position the rifle, and the closeness of him had suddenly felt like the most natural thing in the world. She'd turned in his arms and kissed him properly, not the chaste peck they'd exchanged at their wedding, but something deeper and more honest. Cole had responded with a hunger tempered by careful gentleness, and they'd stumbled back to the cabin through the snow, laughing and kissing and fumbling with cold, stiff fingers at buttons and laces. Their first real joining had been awkward and wonderful, equal parts comedy and passion, and afterward, lying tangled together under heavy blankets, Eliza had felt more at home than she ever had in the town below. "I love you," she'd whispered into the darkness, surprising herself. Cole had pulled her closer, his beard tickling her forehead. "I love you too. Have since you sang to me 4 years ago, I think. Just took me a while to get back to you." The snow had piled deep around the cabin, cutting them off from the outside world. For months they lived in their own universe, just the two of them, the mountains and the silence. Eliza had thought she might feel trapped, might miss the bustle of the inn or the presence of other people. Instead, she felt free for the first time in her life. Cole taught her to read the weather and the seasons, to identify animal tracks in the snow, and understand the language of bird calls. She taught him to appreciate proper baking. His attempts at bread before her arrival had been, in his own words, suitable for killing small animals if thrown hard enough, and to see the beauty and domesticity, the satisfaction of a well-tended home. They talked for hours in the evenings, sitting by the fire while storms raged outside. Cole told her about the years he'd spent wandering, trying to outrun grief after his parents' deaths, and how he'd nearly died a dozen times before staggering into her inn. Eliza shared her memories of her parents, the good times before the cholera, and the slow erosion of her spirit under the weight of the town's judgment. "I used to think I was being punished," she admitted one night, "that God had made me this way as some kind of test or curse, that I deserved to be alone because I wasn't good enough or disciplined enough to be thin." Cole had pulled her into his lap, easy despite her size, and held her close. "You weren't being punished. You were just surrounded by small-minded people who couldn't see past the end of their own noses. Your body isn't a curse, Eliza. It's just your body, the meat and bone that carries your soul around. And your soul is the most beautiful thing I've ever encountered." Spring came late to the mountains, but when it arrived, it transformed the valley into something that looked like paradise. Wildflowers exploded across the meadows, and the streams swelled with snowmelt. Cole and Eliza worked together to plant crops, vegetables and grains that would feed them through the next winter, and to begin expanding the homestead. In May, a trapper named Red Jack, the same man who'd told Cole about Eliza's predicament, arrived at their cabin, leading a pack train of supplies from the trading posts. He'd grinned at the sight of them together. "Heard you made it in time," he said to Cole. "Glad I could help." "You saved her life," Cole said simply. "I won't forget that." Red Jack had shrugged, embarrassed. "The lady gave me extra stew once when I was at that inn, years back. Didn't charge me for it either, and I was dead broke at the time. Figured I owed her a good turn." It was a revelation to Eliza that her small kindnesses over the years had rippled outward in ways she'd never known, creating debts of gratitude that had ultimately saved her when she needed it most. Through Red Jack, they heard news from Bramble Creek. The story of Cole's dramatic appearance had spread through the territory, growing in the telling until it was practically legend. The town had become something of a laughingstock, the place that had tried to sell a woman and been shown up by the very mountain man they'd claimed was imaginary. "Marcus Hendricks lost the inn," Red Jack reported with evident satisfaction. "Turns out once word got around about what he tried to do, people stopped wanting to stay there. He sold it at a loss and moved east. Silas Miller's still there, but his mill's struggling. People are taking their grain to the next county when they can, just to avoid dealing with him." Eliza found she didn't feel the triumph she'd expected at this news. Instead, She felt mostly pity. Those people were still trapped in their small, mean lives, while she was free in the mountains with a man who loved her.